Good evening, Dr. Suryati. My name is Badrul Isham. You can call me Izzy. I will be presenting my master's dissertation on factors influencing fraud in Malaysia, or in other words, determinants of fraud in Malaysia. So first, let's look at Malaysia's economic background before we dwell into the fraud and corruption stuff. So Malaysia has the fifth largest GDP in Southeast Asia, and then Malaysia has the third highest GDP per capita in Southeast Asia. Now, against the world, Malaysia is ranked number 62 in the Human Capital Index and ranked number 25 in the World Competitiveness Ranking. Now, these are the six worldwide governance indicators measured by the World Bank. So these are used to ascertain a country's government or institutional quality. But what's more important is that we look at Malaysia's ranking in these six indicators. Among the top five ASEAN countries, the top five meaning the top five largest GDP in Southeast Asia, the top five countries with the largest GDP in Southeast Asia. So Malaysia is ranked number two for five out of six of the worldwide governance indicators, while Malaysia is ranked number three for voice and accountability. Now let's move on to the fraud and corruption part in Malaysia. So the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent defines fraud as the intentional act designed to deceive others, leading to victims suffering a loss, and the perpetrator receives again, whereas corruption is the abuse of entrusted power for private gain, and this includes bribery. Now, our ex-Prime Minister, Najib Razak, is a perfect example of both perpetrator of fraud and corruption. Fraud and corruption, they also overlap because at the same time you can have entrusted power in a private public company or public sector. At the same time, you can still deceive others for your own private gain. So that's why they overlap. So Najib Razak is an example of the overlap, where he deceived his colleagues and the people of Malaysia to continue the 1MDB scandal, and where he abused his power of Prime Minister of the country to continue the 1MDB scandal. So let's look at the impacts of fraud and corruption. The government of Australia released a very nice article that separates the impact of fraud and corruption into 7 categories. I will only talk about the human impact. For example, if let's say an investment bank commits fraud against a retirement mutual fund, then the people investing in that retirement mutual fund will lose out money. For example, let's say the investment bank may trick the retirement mutual fund to buy securities that the investment bank knows that those borrowers will not pay back, they will most likely default. Then the people investing in that mutual fund will lose out on their money, will lose out on their retirement savings, and this affects a person's livelihood so much. So let's look at Malaysia's performance against corruption. We don't have to look for the past 10 years, we'll just look at the past 3 years. So in 2019, 20 and 2021. So Malaysia has dropped its CPI rank, Corruption Perception Index ranking, from 52nd to 62nd. So there's like 10 places drop in 2 years. And then the CPI score has also dropped quite a lot in the past 3 years. So Malaysia's not doing so well. And this is the problem statement. We will only talk about the general research objective. So we want to find the relationship between Malaysia's economy and the number of fraud offences in Malaysia from 1995 to 2020. To do that, we need to develop an empirical model that includes economic, socioeconomic, and non-economic variables, and then we have to analyze the relationship between them. So moving on to the literature review, let's move on to the fraud triangle. So this is one of the oldest theoretical framework to explain fraud. So yes, 3 elements. If those 3 elements are present, then fraud will most likely happen. So pressure is where there is financial pressure. For example, in financial pressure, you have to keep being rich, or you're becoming poor and you're desperate to get money. And opportunity means there is a lack of internal controls within the company or organization. And then rationalization is where you can justify yourself that you deserve the gain that you made committing the fraud. So that's all three. And with the six variables chosen as fraud determinants in the study, I attempt to illustrate them through the fraud triangle model. So here you can see the economic variables, they they put pressure, financial pressure on the in a fraud triangle. They represent financial pressure, and political stability represents opportunity, because the more instability, the more unstable the government is, the more opportunity there is to commit fraud or corruption. That is the literature review matrix. So far, all of them agree with each other, except for Sorade, which found that business operational risk has a negative effect on foreign corruption, whereas the other two found a positive effect. Now, the gap is that a lot of the studies, they use corruption indexes as proxies for fraud and corruption. Now, these are okay. However, these corruption indexes, they are public perception of corruption. They are not the hard statistics, for example, the arrest cases or the number of investigation cases relating to fraud and corruption. Yes, so they're only based off surveys and public perception. And the studies explaining fraud and corruption in Malaysia, they use internal company and demographic determinants. However, I only found one study that uses economic variables, so there needs to be more studies that utilizes economic variables to explain fraud and corruption in Malaysia. Now, these are the 7 variables in the model, and then these are the sources. From the top left, you can see is the model adapted from Ahmad, and with some modifications. So instead of using GDP, I use GDP per capita to reflect the an average person's wealth in Malaysia. And is used by OMIDI. And then the original model has business operational risk. However, I could not find a good proxy to represent Malaysia's business operational risk, so I left that one out. So regression method will be time series OLS, and of course, the statistics test will test for multicollinearity, heteroscedasticity, and autocorrelation. And figure 3.2 shows the variable signs along with its definition and the expected signs. The expected signs are retrieved from the literature review matrix. Okay, so the multicollinearity test, so far the model does not suffer multicollinearity as none of the variables have a variance inflation factor above 5. Now, from the other tests, heteroscedasticity is present and autocorrelation at the first order is present. So we can use the two generalized least squares method, the Price-Winston regression method, or the Cochrane-Orchard regression method. And we can also use the Newey-West standard errors. So using the generalized least squares, they resulted in a very low F statistics, which leads to a very high p-value. So it shows that the variables, the independent variables, if joined together using this GLS method, they prove to be statistically insignificant. So this model is not this model is not statistically significant. So we have to use the new Western errors, and we found that there are 4 out of 6 independent variables that are statistically significant. Here we have economic freedom. Now, from this table 4.5, the ones that are statistically significant, they agree with the expected signs. So that means they agree with the literature review matrix. That's good to know. Whereas the ones that are statistically insignificant, they go against the literature review matrix. Okay, so these are the limitations. For example, there's a missing year, like political stability and poverty rate are only measured every 2 or 3 years. Then I had to use linear interpolation to cover, to fill in to impute the missing values. Now I have 2 policy recommendations. First one is to increase economic freedom in Malaysia. So to set up programs that happen annually or every 2 years, whose purpose is to review the government departments closely related and important to business activities, and then to identify bottlenecks that are restricting the department's ability to work very efficiently, and then find solutions to get rid of the bottlenecks. After that, we'll be able to see the how much improvement the department has done by measuring the amount of transactions or activities the government department can achieve before and after removing the bottleneck. And then the second one is to monitor the and analyze the determinants of fraud. This study found significant, which is economic freedom, GDP per capita, political stability, and the unemployment rate. So if any of these frauds, if they predict that there is an increase in potential fraud or corruption, then the task force can raise an alarm to the government. Then the government can give more resources to the enforcement agencies such as the Security Commission of Malaysia (SC) and the Malaysia Anti-Corruption Commission (MACC). So with these extra resources, these enforcement agencies will be able to uncover, investigate, and close fraud and corruption cases more efficiently. They'll be able to fight fraud and corruption a lot better. So recapping, we have learned that fraud and corruption are bad for economies, and for the past 3 4 years Malaysia is not improving in its fighting fraud and corruption, and that we have gone through the problem statement of this study. We've gone through the literature review, the theoretical and empirical findings, as well as the literature gap, and we have found that that the generalized least squared methods are unreliable for the model, and that the UE West standard errors have degrees for robustness, and that we have gone through the 2 policy recommendations in order to fight fraud in Malaysia. Thank you very much.